uranium here, a look across Africa's emerging uranium projects. Can I welcome to the stage our four panellists for this one? We have Brandon Munro, who is the CEO of Bannerman Energy. We have Greg Cochran, who is Managing Director and CEO of Aurora Energy Metals. Murray Hill, the CEO of Elevate Uranium, and Andrew Tunks, who is the CEO of ACAP Energy. Okay, so we're talking uranium here. We've got a very diverse panel here. We've got someone with different coloured jackets on, so that's fantastic. Let's start things off with talking a little bit about demand for uranium across the world. What's the picture looking like? Should we start? Who wants to start? We start this end.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. So look, the uranium is only used in nuclear power, tiny bit in medicine, but this is a story about nuclear power's prospects going forward. And what policymakers around the world have realised a few years ago, really emphasised by COP26 and now brought home in dramatic and tragic fashion by the Ukraine war, is that nuclear power is not only a bridging technology, but it's a permanent part of the energy mix going forward. And we've got a source of power that represents 10% of the world's electricity today that will need to grow quite dramatically if this society and this civilization has got any chance of achieving carbon mitigation.
That's an excellent start. I'll just add on to this little tiny part of the market that you mentioned, sort of medicinal purposes or medical purposes. As most of you might know, Australia is kind of somewhat at a political level and has been for about 25 years saying no to nuclear power. And the harsh reality is, though, that it's saving in the order of 100,000 lives a year in Australia alone, just from that small component of nuclear medicine and nuclear isotopes that are diagnostics. So that's a great little success story on the side of what uranium and nuclear can do for us. But as Brandon is saying, the reality is this rapidly bifurcating market that we now have as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has meant that the tailwinds have almost, I'd say almost, never been better for uranium and for nuclear in our future.
It's hard to follow that, isn't it? Look, I'll go back to decarbonisation, electrification. That's all we get shoved down our throat now. And there's only one way to achieve that. You can't decarbonise if you're using or generating carbon from power generation. Nuclear is carbon free, full stop. Electrification, people seem to forget that batteries store energy, batteries discharge energy. Batteries don't generate energy. So the battery's got to get their energy from somewhere. So if you're feeding it with coal, you're feeding it with something else, then you obviously are producing more carbon. So a lot of people in Australia feel comfortable with their new Teslas or whatever, but they're actually making it worse, right? And I won't go into that. But so really, if we're going to achieve what the world want to achieve, which is almost impossible, and then we need nuclear. Renewables, classic examples are Germany and California, both failures. Carbon emissions going up, power costs going up. Renewables need a backup source, and that's why the natural gas industry support new renewables so much, because they are the backup. So that's me.
Andrew, anything to add on the supply side, demand side, demand side? But in terms of going forward, I mean, obviously, there are a lot of projects out there, nuclear projects being built, particularly in China, but it's a fairly sort of stable. If you're an investor looking at the uranium market, there's a fairly predictable, nice, stable supply growth going forward. They take a long time to build, so you know when they're sort of coming along. Is that a big positive that the investors should think about, the sort of stability of the long-term demand?
I think it's a great place to start. But I've been out of the uranium market for many years. So I was at ACAP, and then after Fukushima, I left and I'm back. And what I've seen is a big change in many ways, but also not enough change in people's attitudes towards uranium. And I think that's a really important factor. What I have seen, and I was talking to Brandon about this today, is the embrace of some groups like the English government to start promoting uranium. It's up to the governments to take charge of these things. And I'm very buoyed by what they're doing with potentially small modular reactors. And I very much see new technology as that growth. And I think that's exciting, and I think that's what we need to market. Because since I've come back, what I've realised is that we have not educated people very well, and there's still so much fear and angst around nuclear, and I see that as the biggest hurdle to overcome.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about your projects and how it is sort of developing in the country that you're based in. Brandon, you're in Namibia, that's correct. Tell us a little bit about the environment for building a uranium project in Namibia.
Yeah, well, I'll need to share some of this with... but Namibia is a fantastic operating environment. I had the absolute privilege of living there for more than 5 years, so know it well. It's very accepting of uranium, both at a political, social, environmental level. Swakopmund's the nearest town to our Ratango project, and half the town's infrastructure was built off the back of the Rossing mine that Rio developed in the 70s, which 45 years later is still exporting uranium through Walfish Bay. So Namibia really ticks all of the boxes for acceptance of uranium mining. It doesn't tolerate interference from third-party interest groups who might try and fly down from Amsterdam or somewhere like that. They're quite protective of their own interests, and what a pleasure to be in that operating and developing environment compared to some of our first world compatriots who, have to deal with sophisticated lawfare tactics that the antis are very adept at deploying, as well as tepid at best political support or outright political opposition, as we have in my hometown of Perth.
Absolutely.
I know Greg spent a lot of time in Namibia, but I'll go next. Absolutely, what you say is so correct. I mean, it's a fantastic place to go. Namibia, very supportive. One thing they have is the Namibian Uranium Association. No other country in the world has got a dedicated organisation to the uranium industry. They do a fantastic job of promoting the industry within government, within stakeholders. And yeah, it is everything that it's meant to be for an investor. And Botswana and Namibia are probably the two best countries. Our chairman sitting in the crowd here is his first trip up on Thursday to Namibia. He's quite excited about what it brings. Just put a geologist in Namibia yesterday, first time ever. Very excited about what Namibia has to offer and endorse exactly what Brandon said.
Absolutely. Greg, you're in Namibia, but you've got a project in Oregon as well. How do they compare?
Yeah, so that's I guess part of the reason why I'm sitting here is that I am able to wear multiple hats when it comes to the uranium environment. My roots are quite strangely deep in uranium, and that I'm probably one of the few people in this room in this conference that's physically mined uranium at a mine that was briefly mentioned in news this morning, Baiza Uranium Mine, which is owned by Sibanye-Stillwater. It's not mining uranium anymore, but maybe in the future it may well do that. Across to Gencore Billiton that owned Langer Heinrich, and I was there when it was sold to Acclaim, which then was bought by Paladin, and saw that develop. And then the Uranium One days, which took me to Australia, Honeymoon, which has been developed by Boss, and Kazakhstan JVs with Kazatomprom, and now the US. So I've got this four-continent perspective on uranium and uranium development, and it is fascinating because there is no doubt, no debate, that Namibia is a great place to do business, and in particular for uranium. And the US has struggled for years to re-establish a domestic supply of uranium. But because the tailwinds have changed so dramatically, things are really encouraging now in the US as well. And, so when this particular project was part of a company called Energy Metals, and Uranium One acquired it for $1.6 billion US in 2007, the objective of the then CEO, who today is running Sibanye-Stillwater, was the domestic supply is fundamental in the US, and it's still not there. And that's what excites me the most about our project. It's the largest mineable measured and indicated uranium deposit in the US. It's in Oregon, which I would admit is somewhat challenging from a permitting point of view, but we're right on the Nevada border. So we've got a private property in Nevada. We'll develop the processing plant and we'll license the processing plant in Nevada. So very different aspect environment, but exciting nonetheless.
I think what he said was that Namibia is better.
Yeah, Nevada's better than Oregon. Yeah, we have to redraw the lines a little bit. It's okay. Andrew?
So Botswana has a very different experience in that we are the only uranium resource in Botswana, and when we started in 2005, Botswana didn't even have uranium safety regulations, and we helped the government implement those. What I would say about Botswana is, the wealth of Botswana is largely predicated on diamonds, and everyone knows that it's a finite supply. And they're desperately looking for, other things that will take on that. And so in that sense, we've absolutely been embraced by the Botswana government. They've absolutely come up with a framework for us to work within. And importantly, during the very quiet times of the uranium cycle, the company was able to complete a feasibility study and an environmental impact assessment, and we've been granted a mining license. So and that really went through. Now, I wasn't at the company at the time, but that was exceptional in my opinion. To be, and there was no community outcry or no NGOs involved. So I felt that from a government perspective, we couldn't have been treated better. What we needed was a better uranium price to make the project happen, but the government have been amazingly supportive.
And in terms of the uranium price, that's a good hook onto that. In terms of the uranium price and the valuation of uranium exploration and mining companies, how are things looking? How do you expect things to pan out over the next few years?
Sure. Well, I suppose if you went back a year, you would say we were heading for $100 by June, and that didn't quite eventuate. I think broadly there's always there's currently a very strong sentiment towards increased prices, but I do think that that's coming a bit slower than we had perhaps anticipated, 6 to 8 months ago. I think that, the affairs in Ukraine have certainly, have held us back a little bit around what was going around the nuclear power plants. Brandon mentioned that before. So I feel there's a great wave behind us, and I sometimes wonder why people don't wake up to it and why it's not better, but I think it's a very positive outlook for sure.
Yeah.
We the uranium industry, produces 10% of the world's nuclear power? Is that right?
10% of the world's electricity is from nuclear.
Electricity. So, and the whole industry's got a market capitalisation less than FMG. So, what's gone wrong? So we haven't. The valuation's not there. And the other thing is, I think because the utilities are hearing from us, and we're our own worst enemies, we're going to be in production in this period of time. You look back in 2013, look at all presentations from uranium companies, are going to be in production in 2 or 3 years. The utilities start to believe it, and they're sitting back thinking, well, there's going to be plenty of uranium. But when there's not, I think they're going to be jumping over themselves, and we're going to see the price spike ridiculously high and probably sustain it for a longer period than it did in the boom of early 2000s, yeah.
Yeah, we saw what was really encouraging, I guess, last year was the level of contractual engagement. So contracts are changing their spots, so to speak, in terms of typically there was 2 to 4 year rolling contracts. But now the utilities are recognizing there is a threat to long-term supply. And so they are engaging and thinking more about even talking about 10-year timeframes, which is almost, if not totally, unheard of in the industry. Number one. Number two, they're talking about greater volumes of engaging in contracts with greater volumes over greater periods of time, but the price is still not quite there to incentivize new production. So relatively easy, and let me stress the word relatively easy, because there are not many easy restarts. There are a few out there. Langer Heinrich at Paladin is a classic example of what should be a relatively easy, straightforward restart. Boss Energy's honeymoon may well be, but there's not too many else out there. And so that utilities recognize that, having been burnt in 2004, 5, 6, and again in 2012, but of course the demand evaporated post-Fukushima, so they weren't that worried. So now you've got contracting levels at levels we haven't seen since 2010, and that's really exciting as well.
Yeah, look, Leo, if we look at this from a bigger picture perspective, the uranium cycle is much more elongated than a typical metal cycle, which might typically be 7 years. So we've just come out of a 10-year bear market, which started with 2011 and Fukushima. And I think we saw the signal that was well and truly turning the cycle with the entrant of the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust 2 years ago. So we are 2 years into what is likely to be a 10-year price recovery. And if we look at the last good analogue for this, that wasn't the little spike that we had in 2007 when there was some catalyst-driven market activity that sent uranium price crazy up and then crazy down. The analogue that investors can use to get their eye in here was the 70s oil crisis. A very close analogue in terms of the drivers that are now driving the uranium market as we're 20% into this bull market. We had a Middle Eastern oil crisis. It was an energy-driven crisis that created an enormous demand growth, an enormous construction spurt in nuclear power. Now, we're operating off a bigger base at the moment, granted. However, the growth over the next 20, 30, 40 years in nuclear power will be extraordinary, particularly referencing that very stable, predictable, calculatable demand, because we know where the nuclear reactors are, we know how much uranium they consume, and you can really model it quite precisely. And then if you say, well, as an investor, the thing I'm most interested in is, well, what did price do last time? So in the 70s, as that bull market gained momentum, the price moved in real terms, in today's dollars. It moved well through the $50 that we've started to recover into. And we had a very healthy uranium and nuclear power sector for a number of years at a uranium price in today's terms that was above $200 a pound. And the reason that a market and a sector can be so healthy at those levels, 4 times where we are at the moment, is because the uranium is a relatively small proportion of the end cost of the electricity that comes out the back of a nuclear power station. In the US, which is a very mature market where the capital's largely paid off, it ends up being about 5 to 6% of the cost of the electricity. So when you've got competitive energy sources that are going bananas in terms of the inputs from gas, even shale, or the inputs from the coal, or the inputs from the reversal of subsidies for renewable energy, this sector can easily absorb a 4 times increase in the cost of uranium. And we've seen in the last 2 years similar increases in the other major components that produce nuclear fuel, the cost of conversion and the cost of enrichment. They've all gone up about that much. It's just that uranium's a little bit slower to leave the station for structural reasons in the nuclear fuel sector.
If we're to bring in things on the potential sort of risk side, is there any sort of technologies coming through in terms of the way that the fuel rods are designed, or the efficiency at which they are used up within the reactors, that might impact the demand side going forward?
If anything, it's moving the other way. Like, there is constant work undertaken on improving the efficiencies, the capacity factors, the outputs of nuclear power stations. I mean, they are high-tech operating machines. But what we're seeing is a phenomenon where underfeeding, and I won't go into this, but underfeeding switching to overfeeding. So any of the propeller heads out there like me who understand and enjoy this stuff, basically what that means is the industry is being forced to waste uranium in order to conserve enrichment. And so we're seeing it go the other way around. We're seeing a transition from less efficient use of uranium so that less enrichment is required to create fuel bundles. And that's driven predominantly by the Ukraine war, locking Russia out of the market, and Russia provides 42% of the world's enrichment. So the Western world has to figure out, how do they fill that gap? Well, one way is to overfeed, which wastes uranium.
So meaning you have to just mine higher grade deposits effectively if you try and align that to a gold story or a copper-based metal story. And that is a fascinating thing. From the technical side, of course, small modular reactors are on the cusp of being commercial. And in fact, the first one's going ahead in the US. The home of Oregon happens to be the home of NuScale, which is one of the few listed SMR companies. So I do have this dream or this vision of having homegrown uranium feeding into NuScale SMRs, which would be a great story. But that technological angle, important nonetheless that it is around future growth, the reality is the existing solutions for nuclear power that are already in place are safe, are low risk, technically well understood, and the poster child for success is just look at the UAE, who 15 years ago had nothing. And now, thanks to a tender that was let to the South Koreans, now have 3 operating stations, and the 4th one will be commissioned within the next 12 months. So there's the success story. Power stations delivered on time and on budget, because there's no silly interference from unnecessary regulatory affairs in government. It's not laissez-faire, it's not, hey, do what you like. Those things are amongst the safest nuclear power reactors in the world, delivered within 15 years, just like the French decarbonized their electricity supply in 2 decades. That's how long it's... The Germans have been busy spending 500 billion euros since the fall of the wall on renewables. What have they achieved in decarbonization? Not much. Expensive power, second dirtiest power in Europe. So that's the signal. That's what we need to look to and understand. Technology is important, but there are ready-made, long-established solutions that we can just carry on building.
What's being done to spread the word, though? I mean, you know, the nuclear industry, obviously, every now and again, it has a bad PR problem because, you know, something has happened in the past. But moving forward, obviously the new technologies coming forward, that is increasingly less likely to happen. And we've got these, as you say, great examples of successful nuclear power projects. What is the industry doing to change its image and to get itself front and centre in the energy transition?
I don't think enough. I think that there's still a broad public perception that it is a terrible thing, you know, and but I was very buoyed by things like greens for nuclear energy. I mean, people coming from an environmental background who finally realise that it's the production of electricity itself that's the demon here, and how do we produce electricity at low CO2? So people from Greenpeace or any of those green groups who finally see the light and convert, I think their message is amongst the strongest. But in Australia, like, the government is our worst enemy. I mean, the Liberals had 10 years in power and never talked about nuclear once until they were voted out. And then within a week, they're all on board. And then the new Treasurer comes in and says, well, it takes too long and it's too expensive. And they don't look at things like what happened in the UE. They say, well, we just can't do it. It's too hard. But of course we could do it if we hadn't. Australia has, and like Africa, has many large isolated population centres that would benefit so much from a reliable small nuclear reactor outside. You know, how do you run Mount Isa or Kalgoorlie? How good would they be with a modular reactor?
So everyone likes an argument on a panel, so here we go. I'm just going to take umbrage to the comment that there's a broad perception that nuclear power is a terrible thing. I reckon 10 years ago, yeah, you would have been able to slip that one past me. But let's look at some stats. So 70% of Germans today believe that the 3 remaining nuclear power stations should be extended indefinitely or into the longer term. Even in Australia, which is quite rightly cited as an example of dinosaur purism in its best form, in Australia, about 51% of people either support nuclear power or are not opposed, compared to only 15% of people who oppose nuclear power. So there's actually quite a strong majority now that at the very least support changing of the law in Australia. In the US, it's a very strong public opinion in favour of nuclear power. In Scandinavia, which is often seen as a thought leader in various things social, it's strong support. The Finnish Greens adopt as an official policy, the Greens adopt as official policy to demand the construction of new nuclear power reactors. We're even seeing a swing in Denmark, which has grown rich on promoting wind power and selling wind power into the rest of Europe. There are still holdouts. You've still got holdouts in a handful of relatively insignificant markets, including Australia and unfortunately including a very significant market being Germany. But the tide has dramatically turned. Now, I'm not going to go as far as attributing that success to the industry. I agree that the industry is on a learning curve. The nuclear power industry has existed by keeping its head down, not by putting itself above the parapet and getting out there and actually proclaiming the incredible benefits of nuclear power. But largely through voluntary, non-affiliated advocates, we are seeing a very distinct movement in the constituency of politicians that ultimately will empower them to develop a little bit more political courage.
Absolutely. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you have a question, stick a hand up for our panel here.
Okay, yeah, it's just on most metals, people have a fairly good idea of what the sort of coming surplus or deficit is going to be the next few years. Can you just map out for us how you see uranium being? I mean, it's been a difficult one because there's obviously always been decommissioning of old military stocks and everything. But I mean, what's the panel's best guess as to demand and supply and any deficit which emerges the next few years?
Yeah, okay. I think this one's down to me. I've been a bit involved in this stuff with World Nuclear Association. So it's a very clean supply and demand picture now. You referred to decommissioning of warheads, and that was a huge supply overhang for a number of years, including during the last uranium spike in 2007. Now that's done, that's out. There was also a lot of interference from secondary suppliers. They've now stabilised and are reducing into the long term. So that's a very supply price inelastic source that's now depleting quite quickly because of what I talked before about overfeeding. And then the other interference has been governments, the DOE in the US selling in its stockpiles, and that stopped about 3 years ago. And then finally, what's really suppressed prices and suppressed the evolution of this market has been inventory overhang. So Fukushima happened in 2011, punched an immediate 11% hole in demand for nuclear power. But because everything's done on long-term contracts, the market kept mining and kept supplying and kept filling in utilities with uranium and they only needed, at a global level, 90% of that. So there was a big build-up of inventory. And it's taken decisions by the majors, the three majors in this sector, to reduce their production in Canada and Kazakhstan to run that inventory down. And then in the last 18 months, we've seen the impact of physical buyers really suck out the last of that mobile inventory that has the potential to distort a market. So literally in the last few months, we can now say that we've got a supply and demand picture that's fairly predictable. So to numbers, today the world consumes in burn-up of nuclear reactors about 180 million pounds in rough terms. It's producing about 135, or that's probably going to be down this year by another 5 million pounds, courtesy of Kazakh production being guided down. And then there's about 25 million pounds of secondary supply. And again, there's pressure on that because of Western enrichers wanting to optimise their enrichment. And so they'll probably provide less secondary supplies via underfeeding. So that paints quite a stark deficit picture today. And as we move forward, we will see a gradual decrease in that secondary supply. And even with the development of the shovel-ready projects over the next few years, including Bannerman's Tango project, we still see a significant widening of a deficit, particularly starting in 2028 and then out to 2040. So the scenarios for growth that I favour and that quite closely match World Nuclear Association's 2021 upper scenario see the demand for uranium doubling by 2040. So that's about a 2% year-on-year growth. Now, at the same time, whilst there are ample exploration projects around the world, governments and financiers are going to really need to get their skates on if we're going to have enough uranium projects developing over that period of time to actually infill that gap and meet that dramatically increasing demand. So on the numbers that I prefer to model, China itself by 2040 will consume that 130 million pounds. So in other words, all of the production that we manage to achieve globally in a year, by 2040, China alone will be consuming that. So it gives you a feel for the drivers and the necessary market signals that will be required as this 10 or so year bull market gets into better momentum. And from an investor, I think you can deduce from that an extremely attractive investment proposition over the next 10 or so years.
Absolutely. We have reached the end of time. Well, not the end of time, but the end of this particular panel's time. Thank you very much, our panellists.